A child went missing in the woods. The town blamed the man, but the Vulpine. Woman knew the true monster. The town of Eldon Hollow was small and quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else. Children played freely in the streets, and neighbors greeted each other warmly. Life moved slowly, almost like it was measured in the rhythm of the seasons rather than clocks. The town sat on the edge of a vast forest, dense and ancient, full of tall oaks, pines, and winding paths. The woods were beautiful, even enchanting, but they carried a sense of mystery that made most parents warn their children not to wander too far. Despite this, the forest had always been a part of their lives. People walked there, picnicked there, and sometimes gathered firewood from its edges. Everyone respected its quiet power, but no one feared it until that day. It started like any other sunny afternoon. The sky was clear and blue, and a gentle wind rustled the leaves. Children were playing outside, their laughter ringing through the town. Among them was little Samuel, a lively boy of 7, with bright eyes and endless curiosity. He loved the outdoors more than anything. He would spend hours exploring the edges of the forest, pretending to be a brave adventurer, discovering hidden lands. That day, he had promised his mother he would stay close to the tree line, just enough to watch the squirrels and see the little stream glisten in the sun. But Samuel's imagination often carried him further than he planned. His mother, Mrs. Callahan, was busy preparing lunch when she noticed Samuel's absence. She called his name softly at first, hoping he had just gone to the other side of the yard. When there was no answer, she felt a small, uneasy knot in her stomach. She stepped outside and shouted for him again, louder this time. Still no reply. Panic began to creep in. She ran toward the forest's edge, calling his name with every ounce of her strength. The rustling trees seemed to mock her calls, as if the wind itself refused to answer. Word spread quickly. Soon, neighbors poured out of their houses, each one joining the frantic search. Eldon Hollow had always prided itself on community. When trouble arose, everyone acted together. The townspeople ran along familiar paths, searching through tall grass under fallen logs, and around the little creek that wound through the forest. Everyone hoped it was just a game, that Samuel was hiding somewhere, giggling as he waited to surprise them. But as minutes stretched into hours, hope began to feel thin and fragile. By the time the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows through the trees, fear had settled over the town like a heavy fog. The search parties had spread further, some even venturing deeper than they usually dared. Samuel's small footprints had vanished among the forest leaves, leaving no sign of where he had gone. Parents held their children close, and older townsfolk whispered prayers under their breaths. The forest that had once seemed friendly now seemed to close in, its shadows twisting into shapes that made the heart beat faster. Local authorities were alerted, and soon the sheriff and his deputies were coordinating the search. They brought flashlights, radios, and even dogs trained to track scents. The townspeople followed orders, but still could not contain their anxiety. Every rustle in the leaves, every snapping twig made hearts jump. Some parents began to blame themselves, imagining all the ways they could have prevented this. The forest had never seemed so vast, so unkind. As the evening turned into night, a sense of helplessness spread. The sheriff gathered the townspeople in the small town square, trying to keep everyone calm. He reminded them that panic could make things worse, but it was clear he himself was worried. Samuel had not wandered far before, and the forest was large, unpredictable, and full of places where a child could get lost or hurt. Lanterns were lit, and volunteers continued the search in shifts, moving carefully to avoid missing anything. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, every path looking the same, every shadow hiding 1,000 possibilities. Meanwhile, in a quiet part of the woods, an older woman named Maris watched from a distance. She was known in the town as someone who understood the forest better than anyone else. Her movements were careful and deliberate, like she could read the whispers of the trees. She had seen Samuel running toward the deeper paths, more curious than cautious. While others panicked, she observed calmly, her mind piecing together what could have happened. There was something in the way the wind moved through the branches that seemed to guide her attention towards certain areas. Unlike the rest of the town, She did not rely on hope or fear. She relied on knowledge, patience, and careful observation. As night deepened, the forest became colder and darker. The searchers had to use flashlights, their beams cutting through the shadows like knives. Every small sound, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of a small animal, the crack of a branch made people jump. Parents held tightly to each other, whispering reassurances that felt hollow even to their own ears. Samuel's absence was felt in every corner of the town. His toys sat untouched at home, and his empty chair at the kitchen table reminded everyone of the fragility of life and the thin line between safety and danger. By midnight, it was clear that finding Samuel would not be easy. The sheriff called off large groups and decided to focus on smaller strategic searches, dividing the forest into sections. Some townspeople stayed in the square, huddled together, trying to keep their spirits alive. Others returned home briefly, unwilling to leave entirely, but needing warmth and food to sustain their energy. Sleep came fitfully, if at all, with every creak of the house or rustle outside making hearts leap, even as exhaustion weighed on the town. Quiet determination persisted. Eldon Hollow was small, yes, but its people were strong. They would not give up. They had faced storms, fires, and losses before, but the fear of the unknown made this search unlike any other. A child lost in the forest was more than just a missing person. It was a threat to the sense of safety and trust that had always defined the town. It was a shadow that loomed over every home, every street, and every conversation. By the early hours of the morning, the town had organized search teams that would rotate through the forest continuously. Lanterns glimmered like fireflies among the trees, and the sound of voices calling Samuel's name echoed through the night. Every now and then, a searcher would pause, listening carefully, hoping to hear a faint response. The forest, however, remained silent. Almost as if it was holding its breath, Mrs. Callahan sat in the town square, wrapped in a blanket, exhausted but refusing to leave. She looked at the other parents around her, some crying quietly, some pacing,
Ow!
some staring into the dark forest, as if willing it to return her child. She clutched a small piece of Samuel's clothing, the scarf he had worn that afternoon, to remind herself that he was still out there, somewhere waiting to be found. Her heart ached, and every passing moment without news felt like a lifetime. The first part of the day had ended, but the search had only begun. The forest remained vast and mysterious, and Eldon Hollow was learning, in the hardest way possible, that life could change in an instant. Samuel's disappearance was not just a test of courage. It was a test of patience, resilience, and the ability to see clearly when fear threatened to blind them. And while the town struggled, one quiet observer, moving through the shadows with careful steps, already sensed that the story was far more complicated than anyone imagined. In those early hours, under the cold glow of lanterns and the whispering trees, the town understood one thing clearly. The forest had taken one of their own, and until Samuel was found, nothing would feel safe again. Fear had arrived, and it had a face of uncertainty, mystery, and the unknown. The morning after Samuel went missing, the town of Eldon Hollow was filled with tension that hung heavier than the early mist. People moved quickly from house to house, sharing news, asking questions, and trying to make sense of what had happened. Parents were anxious, their faces pale and eyes wide, while children stayed close to their guardians, sensing the fear but not fully understanding it. The forest, which had always seemed like a place of play and wonder, now appeared dark and threatening. Each tree and shadow seemed alive with unseen danger. Amid the whispers and hurried conversations, a name began to circulate, a man who lived alone at the far edge of the forest. His name was Henry Marlowe, a quiet man in his 40s with graying hair and eyes that seemed to study everything but reveal little. He kept to himself, rarely speaking to neighbors except when necessary, and spent most of his time maintaining his small property near the woods. Henry had no family in town, and his solitary nature made him different, and in a town that valued familiarity, being different often drew suspicion. It began with small, cautious questions. "Did you see Henry near the woods yesterday?" "He was quiet as usual, but I think he left early in the morning. Maybe he saw something, or took Samuel." At first, the questions seemed harmless. a natural curiosity in a town trying to understand a tragedy. But as fear grew, these questions hardened into accusations. People repeated the rumors, and soon Henry became the convenient figure to blame. The simplicity of blaming one person gave the town a sense of control in a situation that felt completely uncontrollable. Henry, for his part, was unaware of the storm forming around him. He had been tending to his small garden that morning, pruning rose bushes and watering vegetables, unaware that his neighbor's eyes were following him with suspicion. When children's toys were found near the edge of the forest and no sign of Samuel appeared, the townspeople's imaginations filled in the gaps. It was easier to believe that the quiet man, who had always kept to himself, could be responsible than to accept the frightening truth that a child had disappeared into the vast, unknowable woods. By midday, the sheriff had called a meeting at the town hall. The room was packed, filled with anxious parents, curious neighbors, and a few town elders who had tried to maintain order. People spoke in hurried voices, some blaming Henry directly, others speaking in hypotheticals but implying guilt. He lived so close to the woods. Maybe he saw the boy, and he doesn't speak much to anyone. He must be hiding something. The sheriff listened patiently, though his brow was furrowed in concern. He had no proof, no evidence. Only the fear that had already taken root in the hearts of the townspeople. Henry arrived at the meeting reluctantly. When he entered the room, the murmurs grew louder. Eyes turned toward him, suspicion hanging in the air like thick smoke. He tried to explain his whereabouts, the work he had done in his garden, and the people he had seen that morning. But no one listened fully. Fear had a way of drowning out reason, and the more Henry explained, the less credible he seemed to the anxious crowd. It was as if his calm and honesty only made people more certain of his guilt. Outside, the search continued. Teams of townspeople combed the forest systematically. But every trail and clearing seemed to lead to more questions than answers. The sounds of voices calling Samuel's name echoed through the trees, sometimes answered only by the soft rustling of leaves or the distant call of a bird. In moments like these, it was easy for imagination to turn shadows into threats and ordinary sounds into signs of danger. Parents clutched their children, and older neighbors whispered prayers under their breath, hoping desperately for a miracle. Amid the chaos, Maris, the woman the town called the Vulpine woman for her sharp eyes and cunning instincts, watched silently. She moved through the crowd and the forest with quiet purpose, noting small details others missed. She observed footprints, broken twigs, and patterns in the forest that suggested someone had passed through, but not in the way the town feared. Unlike the mob that had formed around Henry, Maris did not rely on fear or gossip. She relied on observation, logic, and a deep understanding of human behavior. She noticed something strange about the way people were treating Henry. Their fear had turned into a kind of collective anger, a need to assign blame to calm their own anxiety. Maris could see the truth behind their expressions. The worry for the child was real. But so was the desire to make sense of a senseless situation by labeling someone as the villain. She understood why Henry was being blamed. She had seen the same patterns in towns before, when fear made people mistake difference for guilt. But her instincts told her that he was innocent, and that the real danger was something much less obvious. Henry, aware of the hostility, stayed mostly silent. He knew that any word he spoke might be twisted, that trying to defend himself in the face of the town's fear could make matters worse. Instead, he focused on the search. He joined small teams going through sections of the forest, moving methodically, hoping that his actions would speak louder than words. But even as he helped, some neighbors shot him suspicious glances, and whispers followed him wherever he went. Each suspicious look felt like a weight pressing down on his shoulders. By the afternoon, frustration had grown in the town. The forest seemed endless, and every attempt to find Samuel seemed to lead to more confusion. Some townspeople argued with the search leaders, insisting that they knew where to look or that they had seen Henry acting strangely. Others scolded them, saying that panic and anger were only making things harder. Maris, moving quietly at the edge of the search groups, observed every interaction, noting who acted out of fear, who acted out of care, and who seemed to hide something beneath their words. The forest itself seemed to respond to the tension. Shadows grew longer and darker as the sun dipped lower. Strange noises, falling branches, rustling leaves, distant animal calls made people jump. Every sound became a question, every movement a potential clue. The anxiety of the town reached a fever pitch, and the once friendly forest had become a place of suspicion and dread. Henry felt the change most sharply. People who had once nodded politely at him now avoided his gaze or watched him with mistrust. The loneliness he had always felt was now magnified by fear and accusation. In the midst of this, Maris quietly began to investigate separately. She moved along hidden trails, noting footprints and small disturbances in the undergrowth. Her sharp eyes caught signs that no one else noticed, twigs bent in unnatural ways, patterns in the leaves that suggested more than one person had been moving, and faint traces of something unusual. She did not shout her discoveries, knowing that the town was too caught up in anger and fear to listen. Instead, she quietly cataloged everything, preparing for the moment when understanding. A panic would be needed. By nightfall, the town had exhausted much of its energy, but the fear did not lessen. People gathered in small groups, whispering theories and complaints, while the sheriff tried to maintain order. The blame toward Henry had hardened. Even those who wanted to remain neutral found themselves influenced by the collective mood. It was easier to believe the quiet man near the woods could be guilty than to face the terrifying uncertainty that Samuel could still be lost, unseen and vulnerable. Maris, however, did not waver. She continued to watch, move, and think, keeping her focus on what the evidence suggested rather than what fear demanded. She understood that the true danger was rarely as simple as it seemed. While the town's eyes were fixed on Henry, she noticed subtle signs that pointed elsewhere, signs that only someone willing to look carefully could see. Her calm and patience set her apart, even as the town's anger threatened to overwhelm reason. That night, the forest around Eldon Hollow was alive with sounds, lights, and the silent determination of some and the desperate fear of others. Samuel remained missing, and the search continued. Henry returned to his home, exhausted but determined to help, aware that the town's suspicion would not fade easily. And Maris, moving quietly through the darkness, began to piece together a picture that the rest of the town could not yet see. Fear had taken root in Eldon Hollow, and the townspeople's desire for a clear culprit had made one man the target. Yet the forest held its secrets tightly, and one careful observer knew that the story was far from simple. The real danger, she suspected, had not yet revealed itself, and the answers lay not in anger or rumor, but in patience, observation, and courage. The night ended with more questions than answers, and the town faced the harsh realization that fear could mislead them just as easily as the forest could. Samuel's absence was not just a tragedy, it was a challenge to the town's understanding. Their trust and their ability to see the truth beneath layers of panic and accusation. And while most of Eldon Hollow focused on blaming Henry, one quiet figure prepared to follow the real trail. Knowing that the answers would not come from the obvious suspect, but from careful attention, logic, and the courage to see what others refused to notice. As the sun rose the next morning, the town of Eldon Hollow was quiet but tense. The previous day's fear and anger had left a heavy weight over the streets and homes. Samuel was still missing, and the search teams had returned from the forest after another night of uncertainty and exhaustion. Parents and neighbors huddled in small groups, sharing theories and fears, but no one had any answers. The collective worry had made everyone desperate for explanations, and yet the forest remained silent. As if hiding its secrets deliberately, amid the tension, Maris moved with quiet purpose. Known as the Vulpine woman, she had earned her reputation not through fear or rumors, but because of her unusual ability to notice details others overlooked. Her eyes were sharp, alert, always scanning, and her movements were light, almost fox-like, as if she could slip through the world unnoticed. She understood the forest differently than anyone else in Eldon Hollow. She noticed patterns in the way leaves bent, how footprints shifted, and how small disturbances could reveal much about what had happened. While most people rushed or panicked, she moved slowly, letting observation guide her rather than emotion. Maris began her morning by retracing Samuel's likely path from the previous day. She started near the edge of the forest, where the child had last been seen. The ground was soft from the morning dew, and her sharp eyes caught the faintest impressions, small footprints that matched a child's size. Slight scrapes on low branches and subtle breaks in the grass that hinted at someone passing quickly. She paused frequently, studying each clue carefully. While the town's anger had focused on Henry Marlowe, Maris was following the evidence. Letting it guide her rather than rumors or fear, she noticed something that others had missed immediately. The footprints did not match any single pattern. There were signs that more than one person or something had been moving in the same area. Small scuff marks, a shifted branch, and slightly deeper impressions in the mud suggested a struggle or at least a sudden stop. Maris's mind worked quickly, piecing these clues together into a possible timeline. She knew that the forest could conceal evidence easily, but careful observation could reveal truths that no one expected. Meanwhile, in the town, suspicion of Henry continued to grow. Parents whispered behind his back, neighbors avoided him on the streets, and some even refused to allow him to help with the search. The sheriff, though calm in public, had begun to notice the townspeople's bias and the danger of mob mentality. He knew there was no proof against Henry, yet the collective fear had hardened into judgment. In the mind of the town, the quiet man had become a symbol of their anxiety. Every unexplained noise or shadow in the forest seemed to confirm their suspicions, even when logic suggested otherwise. Maris, aware of the tension surrounding Henry, intentionally avoided the gossip. She did not allow the town's fear to cloud her judgment. Instead, she focused entirely on the evidence. Following the trail deeper into the forest, she noted small details that would have seemed insignificant to anyone else. A broken twig at knee height, a patch of disturbed leaves near a fallen log. The faint sound of a small stream. Each element told part of the story. She mentally mapped these clues, connecting them to the movements of both Samuel and anyone else who might have been nearby. Her instincts told her that the danger was not where the town expected. Henry's home and property were carefully maintained, and he had no reason or history that suggested he could harm a child. The forest, however, was full of hidden paths, abandoned shelters, and places where someone could hide. Maris understood that fear often blinded people to reality. The town's eyes were fixed on a single, convenient suspect, but the evidence pointed elsewhere. She had learned long ago that real threats often wore ordinary faces, and that appearances were not reliable guides. Maris spent hours moving quietly through the forest, pausing frequently to observe. She listened to the sounds of the forest, the bird song, the rustle of leaves, the faint trickle of the stream, and compared them to the patterns of movement in the ground. Her mind worked like a puzzle, placing each piece carefully and checking it against the others. The forest seemed alive to her in a way it did not to anyone else. She could sense subtle changes in the wind and the position of shadows that hinted at where someone might have passed. Around midday, she found more evidence that deepened the mystery. There were faint marks on tree bark that suggested someone had climbed or held onto them, and small scuff marks on the forest floor that indicated hurried movement. These details did not match Henry's known habits or abilities. They suggested someone stronger and more deliberate. Maris crouched down, inspecting the marks carefully. She realized that the timeline of these signs aligned closely with the child's disappearance, suggesting that someone had been following or intercepting Samuel. Meanwhile, the town continued its chaotic search. People were exhausted, frustrated, and afraid. Some teams were arguing about which areas to search next, while others were quietly praying for a miracle. The sheriff tried to coordinate the effort, but the growing tension made organization difficult. The townspeople's fear and suspicion created distractions, causing them to overlook the very details Maris was noticing. She knew that the key to finding Samuel lay not in panic, but in careful attention to the forest itself. Maris continued to track subtle changes in the environment. She noticed that certain paths seemed avoided by animals, which could indicate human presence. Broken branches and slightly disturbed soil suggested hurried movement, while other areas remained untouched. By comparing these differences, she could narrow down the likely areas where Samuel might have gone. Her method was slow, deliberate, and exhausting. But she knew that rushing or relying on assumptions would lead to mistakes. By late afternoon, Maris had pieced together a rough path of Samuel's movements. The child had wandered farther into the forest than anyone had realized, drawn by curiosity and the lure of adventure. Along the way, someone or something had intersected with him, leaving subtle signs that only a trained observer could interpret. Maris felt a chill as she considered the implications. Samuel was not simply lost. He had been intercepted, and the forest held the clues to understanding what had happened as the sun began to dip lower. Casting long shadows through the forest, Maris noticed another unusual detail. There were faint traces of movement in areas where the ground was soft and the leaves thick. These traces suggested deliberate action, careful but hurried. Someone had moved purposefully, avoiding detection, leaving behind only the faintest signs of their presence. Maris crouched down to examine the ground closely. Confirming what she had suspected for hours, the forest was hiding a story that the town's fear had blinded them to. While the town's anger still focused on Henry Marlowe, Maris realized that she needed to follow this new trail quietly. The forest itself was giving her guidance, showing her where to look next. Every broken branch, every displaced leaf, and every footprint was part of a hidden map that only someone patient and observant could read. She did not rush. She moved deliberately, letting her instincts guide her while always checking the evidence carefully. By nightfall, Maris had established a clear path of evidence that pointed away from Henry. The forest's clues suggested that the true danger was not the quiet man, but someone or something that had been hiding in plain sight. Unnoticed because people expected danger to look a certain way. Her observations also showed that Samuel's movements were deliberate and curious, not careless. He had wandered into areas that seemed safe at first glance. The forest's complexity had concealed subtle threats. As darkness fell, Maris returned to the edge of the forest to rest briefly. She looked back at the small town below, its lights glowing faintly through the trees. She knew that the town's fear would continue to cloud judgment, and that the anger toward Henry would not dissipate easily. But she also knew that the forest held the answers, and that patience, observation, and courage were the only ways to uncover the truth. While the town blamed a convenient target, Maris was already following the trail that would lead to the real story. That night, as the town slept uneasily, Maris remained awake. Reviewing the evidence she had collected and planning her next moves, she understood that finding Samuel would require more than hope. It would require understanding the forest, the patterns of movement, and the hidden truths that the town refused to see. Fear had blinded the others. But Maris trusted her instincts and the careful clues left in the world around her. The forest was vast, mysterious, and full of life, but it was also speaking to her, whispering its secrets through subtle signs that most people overlooked. The Vulpine woman knew that the answers were there, and that one day soon, careful observation and courage would uncover the truth. Until then, she remained watchful, moving silently, listening to the forest in a way that only someone with patience, intelligence, and intuition could. By the following morning, Eldon Hollow was gripped by a tension that seemed to have seeped into every home, street, and shadow. Samuel had been missing for 2 full days, and the fear that had started as quiet worry had now hardened into frustration, suspicion, and anger. Parents walked through the town with anxious eyes, their minds racing with every possibility, no matter how unlikely. Conversations in the market, the church, and the streets often turned to blame. A large part of the town remained convinced that Henry Marlowe was responsible. A quiet man made a target because he was different, isolated, and easy to fear. Meanwhile, Maris moved quietly at the forest's edge. Her mind had not rested since she began her careful observations. Each day, the forest revealed new signs, subtle and often overlooked, that hinted at what had actually happened to Samuel. Maris had been following these signs quietly, connecting the dots in ways the town could not imagine. Broken twigs, slight indentations in the soil, displaced leaves, faint marks on tree bark. All told a story if one knew how to read them. She had learned long ago that fear made people blind, and anger made them careless. Maris decided to enter the forest again, following the trail she had traced the previous day. Her movements were deliberate and careful. She examined every branch, every footprint, every sign that could reveal the presence of anyone who had been near Samuel. The forest seemed almost alive to her, whispering secrets through the rustling leaves and shifting shadows. She noticed patterns that were impossible to see from the town's viewpoint. Patterns that suggested someone had been moving in a deliberate and hidden way through the trees. By late morning, Maris came across something new, evidence that suggested Samuel had been intercepted by someone the town had never suspected. A faint set of footprints, larger than Samuel's, but careful and deliberate, intersected with the child's path. Nearby, a small, folded piece of cloth had been caught on a bush, likely snagged during a struggle or hurried movement. Maris crouched to examine it closely. The cloth was clean, not torn or stained, but its placement suggested a hasty encounter. She realized that the forest had been keeping a secret, and that this evidence was a key to uncovering the truth. While Maris studied the forest, the town continued to focus its attention on Henry. Rumors had grown louder, fueled by fear and a desperate need for answers. Some townspeople claimed to have seen him near the woods at odd times. Others imagined suspicious behavior that had no basis in reality. Fear had a strange power. It could twist ordinary actions into evidence of guilt. Henry had tried to help with the search, but his efforts were often met with distrust. Even the sheriff, aware of the lack of real evidence, struggled to keep the townspeople calm. Maris, however, was unfazed by the town's panic. She continued to observe carefully, following the trail that led deeper into the forest. Each step she took was measured, her mind cataloging details that seemed insignificant to anyone else. She noticed the direction of fallen leaves, the pattern of disturbed soil, and even the way small animals had avoided certain paths. These small observations began to form a clearer picture. Someone had been hiding in the forest, deliberately avoiding detection while moving in and out of Samuel's path as the day progressed. Maris' understanding of the situation deepened. She realized that the forest itself had been a witness, leaving subtle clues that only a careful observer could read. Broken twigs indicated sudden stops. Slightly bent branches suggested someone had passed quickly, and faint scuff marks in soft soil revealed hurried movements. These clues did not match Henry's usual routines or known abilities. They suggested a different presence, one that was deliberate, careful, and intent on remaining hidden. Maris moved with a quiet urgency, aware that time was critical. Samuel was still missing, and every moment mattered. The evidence she found suggested that the child had not wandered randomly, but had been influenced or intercepted along the way. This was not an accident of curiosity. It was a calculated presence, hidden in plain sight, but leaving subtle traces for someone perceptive enough to follow. Maris understood that discovering the truth required patience, attention, and courage. The town's anger and fear had blinded them, but careful observation would reveal what they could not see. By mid-afternoon, Maris came across another sign, a small, nearly hidden path that led to a clearing in the forest. The ground was softer here, with deeper impressions that suggested a struggle or hurried movement. Maris knelt to study the marks, carefully measuring distances and directions in her mind. It was clear that Samuel had been moving through this area, but not alone. Someone larger had been guiding or perhaps chasing him. The forest was full of subtle signs, and each one confirmed her suspicion. The real threat was not the quiet man at the town's edge, but someone using the forest's shadows to their advantage. Maris' thoughts returned to Henry. She knew he was innocent, yet the town's anger remained fixed on him. It was a predictable pattern. Fear caused people to blame the easiest target, even in the absence of evidence. While the townspeople were distracted by suspicion and rumor, Maris focused on the forest and the clues it provided. Her mind pieced together a timeline of events, reconstructing Samuel's movements and the movements of the hidden figure who had intersected with him as the sun began to lower in the sky. Maris followed the trail to a shallow depression in the ground, partially hidden by leaves and branches. There she found a small toy one she recognized as belonging to Samuel. Its presence confirmed her growing understanding. Samuel had been taken off the obvious paths and into areas where few would notice. The placement of the toy also suggested that the child had not been hurt by the hidden figure, but rather controlled, guided, or even trapped. The forest held the evidence, but understanding it required care and patience. While Maris examined the evidence, the town continued its chaos. Search parties had grown disorganized, with people arguing over where to go next. The focus on Henry had consumed much of their attention, leaving little room to notice the subtle signs in the forest itself. Maris recognized the danger of this misdirection. Fear and suspicion were powerful, but they were poor substitutes for careful observation and reasoning. Only by following the evidence, not the anger, could the true story be uncovered as evening approached. Maris gathered her notes and reviewed everything she had seen that day. She could now identify the likely route Samuel had taken and the interactions he had experienced along the way. It was clear that the real danger had been hiding in plain sight and that the child had been both clever and cautious. Moving through the forest in ways that suggested awareness of potential threats, Maris's mind worked quickly, planning the next steps to follow the trail to its source. By nightfall, she was certain of one thing. The forest had been concealing a truth that the town could not yet face. Samuel's disappearance was not random, and the real threat was not the man they had chosen to blame. The forest itself had been a witness, leaving subtle signs that only a careful observer could interpret. Maris knew that patience, attention, and courage were required to reveal the full story. While the town's fear had blinded them, she had the clarity to follow the trail and understand what had really happened. That night, as Eldon Hollow settled into uneasy sleep, Maris prepared for the next day. She would follow the trail further, observing, analyzing, and piecing together the puzzle that the town could not yet comprehend. Samuel's fate depended on her careful attention and skill, and she knew that time was critical. Fear might mislead the town, but observation and courage could uncover the truth, as the forest whispered around her. Maris felt a quiet determination. She understood that the real danger was deliberate, patient, and hidden. It had used the forest's complexity to mask its actions, relying on the town's fear and assumptions to remain undetected. But the forest had also left a trail, and Maris had the ability to read it. She knew that soon, very soon, the real story would emerge. The child's safety, the clearing of the innocent, and the uncovering of the true threat all depended on her focus, patience, and courage. The night ended with silence. Yet a sense of urgency remained. The forest had kept its secrets, but Maris had begun to unravel them. The town's anger toward Henry would persist. Yet she knew the truth was far more complex and dangerous than anyone had imagined. With each step she took, she drew closer to understanding the real monster lurking in the shadows, the one the town could not see. And while the townspeople slept, blinded by fear and suspicion, Maris prepared to follow the evidence wherever it led. The morning after her discoveries, Maris rose before dawn, the forest still wrapped in a quiet, cool mist. She knew that time was running out. Samuel had been missing for 3 days, and every passing moment increased the risk to the child. She moved carefully, quietly, letting her eyes and instincts guide her as she followed the trail she had begun to trace in the previous days. The forest, which had seemed dark and unknowable to the town, revealed its secrets to her in subtle ways: the disturbed leaves, bent branches, faint footprints, and tiny scratches in the bark of trees. As she moved deeper into the woods, she began to piece together the final sections of Samuel's path. The clues were clear now. The child had wandered off, curious and playful, and had unknowingly entered an area where someone had been waiting. The person had not wanted to be seen. Every careful movement left a trace that Maris, with her patience and sharp perception, was able to read. She realized that the danger was deliberate and calculated, not accidental. Someone had been hiding in the forest, using its natural shadows and paths to conceal their actions. Meanwhile, the town was beginning to sense that the anger toward Henry Marlowe might have been misplaced. Whispers of doubt moved through Eldon Hollow as some of the townspeople began to notice inconsistencies in their accusations. A few brave individuals had accompanied search teams near, Henry's property and realized that there was no evidence to support their suspicions. Henry himself, tired and hurt by the false blame, quietly helped where he could, though the shadow of suspicion still lingered over him. It was clear that fear had clouded judgment, and some in the town began to question whether they had been too quick to condemn. Maris continued her careful exploration. She noticed a small clearing hidden beneath overhanging branches, partially shielded from view by the surrounding trees. Here, she found more evidence. Footprints that did not belong to Samuel, signs of hurried movement, and small items that had been left behind, perhaps dropped in distraction or carelessness. The marks indicated that someone had been using this clearing as a temporary hiding place. Watching and guiding Samuel without leaving obvious traces, Maris realized that the hidden figure had been clever and patient. But no one could hide entirely from a keen observer, using all the clues she had gathered over the past days. Maris finally traced the path to a small, abandoned cabin, hidden deep within the forest. It was the kind of place that most people would have walked past without noticing, completely camouflaged by trees and underbrush. Maris approached cautiously, knowing that the person inside might still be nearby. She paused, listening carefully. Inside, she could hear faint sounds, Samuel's voice calling softly, and another voice speaking in low, urgent tones. Her heart raced as she realized the child was alive. Samuel's curiosity had led him into a dangerous situation, but he had not been harmed in the way the townspeople feared. Maris moved quietly around the cabin, studying the surrounding area to ensure there was no immediate danger. She noted the layout and the exits, preparing a careful plan to approach and safely rescue Samuel. Her mind worked quickly, connecting all the details she had observed over the past days and imagining the final steps needed to bring the child back to safety inside the cabin. Maris finally saw the figure responsible. It was not Henry, nor anyone the town had suspected. The person was someone who had always seemed respectable, unremarkable, and ordinary. Their appearance was calm, even gentle, but their actions had placed Samuel in danger. Maris watched silently for a moment, confirming that the child was unharmed but clearly frightened. She realized that the danger had been real, but not obvious. The forest, the person's careful concealment, and the town's fear had all worked together to hide the truth. With steady hands and a calm voice, Maris approached the cabin. She spoke gently to the hidden figure, explaining that the child needed to be returned safely to the town. The person, realizing they could not continue to hide, stepped aside without resistance. Maris entered the cabin and knelt beside Samuel, who looked at her with wide eyes, frightened but trusting. She spoke softly, reassuring him and guiding him to stand. Slowly and carefully, she led the child out of the cabin, ensuring that every step was safe and deliberate. As they emerged from the trees, Maris felt a rush of relief. Samuel was unharmed, his spirit intact, and the danger had been removed. The forest, which had seemed so mysterious and threatening, had also been a guide, leaving subtle signs that allowed her to navigate and discover the truth. She returned through the woods carefully, keeping Samuel close and ensuring that they avoided any remaining hazards. Each step brought them closer to the town and to the safety and relief that awaited them there. When Eldon Hollow saw Samuel return, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Parents cried tears of relief, neighbors shouted and clapped, and the sheriff, who had been coordinating the search, felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The child's safe return brought a mixture of joy, gratitude, and reflection. The townspeople, who had so quickly blamed Henry, were forced to confront the consequences of their fear-driven assumptions. Henry himself was quietly vindicated, though the scars of suspicion would take time to heal. Maris, as always, remained in the background. She had observed, analyzed, and acted with patience and courage, guiding the town to the truth without demanding recognition. She knew that the real monster had not been obvious, and that fear had nearly led the town to blame the wrong person. Her careful observation and understanding of human behavior in the forest had made the difference, and Samuel's safety was a direct result of her skill and determination. Over the following days, Eldon Hollow began to reflect on what had happened. The townspeople slowly realized that fear and assumptions could cloud judgment. and that it was important to look carefully at the evidence before pointing fingers. Henry was gradually accepted back into the community, and efforts were made to restore his reputation. The forest regained its place as a part of life in the town, but it was now treated with greater respect and awareness of its hidden dangers. Maris, meanwhile, returned to her quiet life, continuing to observe the world around her with sharp eyes and careful attention. She had saved a child, revealed the truth, and shown the town that courage and patience were more powerful than fear and suspicion. Samuel, now safe at home with his family, would carry the memory of his adventure and the woman who had guided him back to safety. The town had learned a hard lesson. The real dangers are not always what they seem, and truth requires careful observation, courage, and a willingness to look beyond appearances. In the end, the story of Samuel's disappearance became a story of reflection, courage, and wisdom. The town remembered the fear, the anger, and the mistakes, but they also remembered the quiet heroism of Maris. Henry was cleared, Samuel was safe, and the town had learned that real monsters sometimes hide behind ordinary faces, and that understanding requires more than fear. It requires attention, patience, and a steady, careful heart. The forest, silent and ancient, seemed to settle after the chaos, as if acknowledging that the story had run its course. And Maris, the Vulpine woman, returned to her observant life, knowing that the forest and the world still held secrets, waiting for those who were willing to see, understand, and act with courage.